Picture this. You're dropped onto an island in an archipelago, or chain of islands, in what's currently the country of the
Wow.
Philippines. However, there's no city buildings or roads. Why? Well, you've been dropped into the Visayas region of the Philippines before Spanish colonization, sometime before the 16th century. There's plenty of life surrounding you, but you have zero clue about your surroundings or the people that share this land with you. But don't worry, I'll give you the details to understand and survive these Visayan lands and people that you've been surrounded with. First, we have to talk about the geography of the Visayan Islands because it played a big role in the life of the people inhabiting the island. So, a quick rundown. The island chain consisted of 7 large islands and 700 other smaller regions, often consisting of tropical, humid, and hilly terrain. However, probably the most important geographic feature of the island was actually the seas that surrounded the islands, because it was the most active region where many Visayans interacted. Because of this, you're more likely to see settlements on the coasts of these islands. I know where to find them, you're probably thinking to yourself in the middle of the island. Like, I could hear you thinking that. But what do they look like? Well, for starters, early Spanish colonizers noted that Visayans were medium in size and had long hair. The range of their skin tones ranged from tan skin to darker brown skin. However, we should probably take their notes on the skin tones with a pinch of salt because they didn't really like people of darker skin tones. On the other hand, Visayans were more observant of cosmetics instead of skin tone. One of the more prominent features of Visayans were tattoos.
Wow.
They were vital for social status because men would gain them in battle, sort of like the medals that our own soldiers get from being on the field. But just because they were necessary for status doesn't mean that they were easy to put on, because many got infections and even died during the process of getting tattoos. But that does make the survivors like extra cool though, I'm not gonna lie. When it came to clothing, they didn't do too much. Typically, the average clothing was cloth undergarments paired with a long tube skirt and a blanket on top. Maybe for something formal, they'd use longer clothing like robes. But to be fair, if I fought tooth and nail to get some tattoos, I'd probably also be flexing them 24/7. Right. Anyways, what did these settlements even look like? Well, to start off, we need to know how their villages were run. The Visayas region was a chiefdom with a 3-tier class system where villages were run by a chief known as a datu. This position was hereditary, which means that leadership ran in the family. And oftentimes, chief families would actually marry between each other to gatekeep their rankings from anybody else. That's crazy. Anyways, the role of a datu was basically just to keep the village afloat. They would govern their village doing things like judging criminals, and they would lead in battle, basically what any leader should be doing. Datu also had the largest houses, being made of sturdy wood and stretching out to 30 meters. It served both as a home and a town center where disputes were settled, kind of like what I imagine medieval castles were like back in the day. Underneath the Datu were the Timawa, who were loyal freed subjects of the Datu. Timawa often participated in battles and were sort of like knights to a king. And like previously stated, they could also get tattoos for the time in battle, for status. They would get some of the spoils of war, however, they were quite restricted in collecting, as it was looked down upon if you became wealthy from it. Basically, everybody else fell under the Orphan class, who were considered commoners or laborers, slaves even. Because the way the mentality of crop trade worked, where giving somebody crops means the other person should give double when they could, made interest rates so high that paying debt was a common occurrence. And the way that debt was paid most of the time was by performing agricultural labor, because agriculture was still something that was being developed during that time period. Matter of fact, there were actually levels to this tier class, as some were considered more enslaved than others. For example, some would have their own homes, while others would live with their masters. Both the Tamawa and the Orapun lived in cottages of wood, which were constructed with the possibility of movement towards wherever agriculture could be done. But also, the fact that both of these classes lived in the same setting in the same type of house really goes to show that everybody else besides the Datu were basically the same group of people. Now that we know why and how their society ran like it did, we can learn more about their daily life. When it comes to food, Visayans relied on their fishing and agriculture as their main sources of food. Fishing was their main source of protein because of the abundance of fish and other seafood that passed through their shores, which they often caught with things like nets, spears, and traps. In addition to the protein they got from their seafood, they also used the abundance of the rain in the region to their advantage and planted many crops such as millet, taro, yams, sago, udarant, and most importantly, rice, which they ate and traded everywhere, eventually even on the Silk Road. Speaking of the Silk Road, Visayas were actually involved in plenty of trade with other Southeast Asian civilizations. Like previously discussed, Many villages are on the shores of the islands, and so boats were the bridges between them and other societies like ancient China, some Islamic nations in the area, and Indian societies, which would all influence the region in the future. Some of the goods that they received were novelties like spices and hardware, which they would exchange for things like rice and gold. It's up to you whether that was an equivalent exchange or not. The Silk Road didn't just exchange goods, but also ideas. Visayans were a people who were deeply connected to nature and practiced polytheism similar to Indian beliefs, where their gods represented natural forces like the sun, moon, and water. They would often prepare offerings to appease the natural spirits and, make their crops grow a little taller this harvesting season. And also make sure that bad spirits didn't eat your liver. The usual. Their complex ideas, such as their mathematics and astronomy, also influenced their belief system as well. Visayans often observed constellations and phases of the moon to observe time and also the best time to observe crops so that they would be the most plentiful. The moon and all of its phases held a very special place in Visayan belief. For example, the new moon, when it was fully dark, was a time that was believed to be full of monsters and witches that would eat your liver. Whereas the full moon was praised for its extravagance. Okay, that was a lot, but those were the basics. If I were to summarize Visayan life before Western influence in one sentence, it would be that Visayans used the geography of their land to form rich lifestyles with their abundance of resources. Their lifestyle was simple on paper, but there was so much to it that a simple video could not do it justice. The only way that you could truly get to understand and appreciate their lifestyle is if you actually were dropped onto the Visayan Islands during that time of Philippine history. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope your attention span isn't cooked. Also, shout out to William Henry Scott for being the main historian on this pretty niche topic.